de Primera Infancia. Les invitamos a tomar asiento. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. A continuación tendremos el panel ¿Qué hemos aprendido sobre programas escalables en primera infancia? Esta es una presentación de la edición especial de Primera Infancia de la revista Pediatrics. Invitamos al escenario a Maureen Black, que nos hará una presentación sobre Promoting Childhood Development Globally Through Caregiving Interventions. Bienvenida al escenario, Maureen.
Maureen Black, miembro distinguida y experta internacional en el desarrollo de la primera infancia, Universidad de Maryland. Maureen Black es profesora de pediatría en la Facultad de Medicina de la Universidad de Maryland, miembro distinguida de RTI International y profesora adjunta de Salud Internacional en la Facultad de Salud Pública Bloomberg de Johns Hopkins y de Psicología en la Universidad de Maryland, Condado de Baltimore. La doctora Black es una psicóloga pediátrica que realiza investigaciones sobre la prevención de disparidades de salud asociadas con el desarrollo temprano de los niños, incluida la pobreza, las deficiencias nutricionales y la falta de oportunidades de aprendizaje temprano. Ha realizado investigaciones sobre el desarrollo infantil temprano en Bangladesh, India, Guatemala, Eswatini y Estados Unidos. Tiene más de 400 publicaciones y ha formado parte de comités asesores de los Institutos Nacionales de Salud y otras organizaciones locales, nacionales e internacionales, incluidas UNICEF, la Organización Mundial de la Salud y el Grupo del Banco Mundial.
Greetings, and thank you very much. Hope you had a lovely lunch. And I know you had an amazing morning, as I did. I'd just like to start by thanking very much FEMSA and Tech Monterrey, as well as the Childhood Development Center for inviting me to spend the day with you. I'm incredibly impressed by all of the things that I've heard, all of the things that I've seen, and of course this amazing university. So thank you very much. It's really an honor to spend the day with you. I'm going to be talking about promoting early childhood development globally through caregiver interventions. This is a supplement to a journal of pediatrics, and so I will share the new findings from the supplement with you. What this represents is childhood, and you can see that it starts actually prior to pregnancy, and then look how it grows from birth through the 6 to 9 months, and then 1 to 3 years, and 3 to 5 years, up 8 to 10, 12, 15. So there's a continuous pathway through early child development. We're going to be talking about this stage right here, from about 6 to 9 months to about 1 to 3 years. So it's a stop along a continuous pathway. Just to give you a little guided tour of where we're going this afternoon, there are 3 components to my talk. I'll talk a bit about the background of child development, and then I'll share what's new from the supplement that we published in Pediatrics, and then I'll end with some thoughts about what's happening in the future. So let's go. If we look at children's development, you can see that it starts at conception, and then it continues on a trajectory through birth and childhood and adolescence and on into the next generation. So we have healthy growth and learning throughout life and into the next generation. Well, that's wonderful. But what happens, unfortunately, is that sometimes things go awry. And when they go awry very early in life, then the disparities tend to increase over time and increase even into the next generation. So this poor growth and learning continues. So what we're going to talk about is how to disrupt that red pathway and push it a little closer to the blue pathway through life. This is a picture of early brain development. And you can see what I like about this slide. This is a bit of Dr. Levitt's talk as he talked about brain development. So what I like about this is it starts at -9, or it starts at conception. And then it goes up by month to birth, and then it goes up by month to age 1, and then it goes up by years. So I've drawn a box around conception to age 2. And this is the first 1,000 days, because if we take 9 months from conception to birth, and then 24 months from birth to age 2, then we have 33 months. And if we multiply those 33 months by the number of days, 30 days, we get 1,000. So we can see that what happens during that first 1,000 days is phenomenal. It starts prior to birth, and you can see that auditory cortex and visual cortex come online, that synaptogenesis starts very, very early, that myelination starts early, so that there's a tremendous amount of development that happens in those first 3 years. Now, this is an audience participation activity. What I'd like you to do is to find your age. Can you find your age on this chart? Okay, what's going on right now in your brains? Well, that would be not much. What we're just trying to do at this point is to keep it together, because we're losing. Each day we're losing a little more. So it reminds us why if we're interested in brain development, where do we want to start thinking? We want to start thinking very early. It's not to say that what happens later in life is not important. It is important. But when you have a strong start, then you're in much better shape to continue through life. So that's why I somehow managed to work this slide into most talks, because it gives us a visual picture of why we're focusing on very early development. So we're going to take a little pathway, a little tour of the past 30 years, and what has led us also to child development. Now, what has happened early on is that it's the era of child survival. And what we learned is that we've been able to have a 60% decline in under 5 mortality. But what that had meant that in many, many areas of the world, prior to 1990, there was a very, very high rate of child mortality, primarily if that's children under age 5 of infant mortality. And through low-tech methods, we've been able to decrease that by 60%. So that means if a family had 6 children and they knew that 3 to 4 of them might not make it, now they could have 2 children and they're likely to make it. And so that is what happened, that with a major decline in child mortality, there was a decrease in fertility. And now in many parts of the world, we're at replacement. So that as there was a decrease in death, in early death, and a decrease in fertility, at the same time, there were increases in the availability of primary school. And so families then were very interested in sending their children to school, because their children were likely to live, likely to make it. So we saw increase in children's schooling. At that same time that we've had research in early brain development that showed the impact of interventions, and that interventions were particularly effective among undernourished children. So with this background, then there was a groundswell, both from leadership, policy groundswell, as well as a family groundswell, that we have to ensure that children are thriving. Thriving means not only living, not only surviving, but also being educated and doing well. So what this led is to what we call nurturing care. And we'll talk about nurturing care throughout this. So you'll see how that incorporates early child development and puts our focus on that very, very early period of life. This is nurturing care, and it represents 5 components. The most important aspect is that it's a system. And as a system, it means that all of these components work together. So the components include the things that you know or that you could ask your grandmother. It's what we all know is important to children. And it includes, not in any particular order, it includes having good health, it includes having adequate nutrition, it includes having opportunities for early learning, opportunities to play, it includes security and safety, and it includes responsive caregiving. That means someone who listens to you and talks to you. These are all important. It's not that one is more important than the rest. And as a system, if any one of them is out of alignment, the system doesn't work. So they're all necessary, and there's no single one that is sufficient on its own. So this nurturing care for early childhood development, the scientific basis to that, you've already heard, because several people mentioned the Lancet series that was published in 2017. That provided the scientific basis to this. And then in 2018, the World Health Organization, the World Health Assembly adopted it. And it's been adopted by the World Bank and by multiple other international organizations. And so it's been introduced globally. It's a very simple concept in terms of having these 5 areas, and then now our job is to sort out how to put them in alignment. So it provides the guidance to promote children thriving, quite straightforward. Now, if we look at how it works, this is what children's brain expects and needs. And how does it happen? Well, you can see the nurturing care symbol in the center of the concentric circles. And the first level in the concentric circle is the caregiver. That happens at home. That's straightforward. It's the caregiver providing those 5 components to a child, but not alone. Doesn't happen alone. You can see the next concentric circle means the communities, and the communities provide support to the caregivers. And how do they do that? Well, through safety, through opportunities within the communities, through caring about children, and what goes beyond that? That's supportive services. So those are healthcare services, nutrition services, a whole host of services for families and for children. And then beyond that, we have enabling policies. Well, what kind of policies would support children and families? Things like parental leave, things like fair pay, things like justice. All of these things support children because they support families. So it together works as a system of support. Now, if we move forward, I mentioned that in the 90s, we learned that early intervention works. How did we learn that? Well, there's a landmark study that was done in Jamaica by Sally Grantham McGregor. And so let me show you how this study works. I forgot to mention to you that this talk includes data. We always have data. And it includes stories. And when you put data and stories together, as Professor Levitt said, it works. So let's see if we can tell you a story. Well, this happened 32 years ago. Some people in this room were not even alive 32 years ago, but life was going on. So this study was done, as I said, in Jamaica, and the way that they did it is that there are 5 groups of children. So there's one group, or one set of groups, where the children were stunted. Stunting is a marker of chronic undernutrition. It's a marker of other things too, but primarily it's chronic undernutrition. So 4 of the groups were stunted, and they were randomly assigned to these 4 groups. You see the red group? So those stunted children received supplementation, that's extra milk. This is in the first 2 years of life. So they received extra milk and stimulation. That means they got a home visitor for 2 years. The next group only received the home visitor. The next group only received the supplementation. And the last group got treatment as usual. So treatment as usual meant nada. Okay. And then there was a 5th group. They were not stunted, and they did not receive anything either. Okay, so they were measured periodically. And what happened at age 2? Oh, you can see that the group that received both the supplementation and the stimulation did not look any different. This is a measure of a developmental quotient, so it includes not only cognition but other areas of development. They didn't look any different. Okay, this was published in 1991. So did people immediately move into action to implement this program? The answer is no. They did not. So here we are, 32 years later, thinking maybe we should be moving forward. So folks, we have a bit of work to do. But this is where we started. This has now been transitioned into what's called reach up and learn. And so steps have been taken to enable it to be implemented in other countries, and we have started scaling it. But it's taken a long time. So one of the opportunities of the center is to work on how to move things a bit faster. Now, you might say, well, that was fine at age 2. But then what happens? So if we invest in very early child development, what? So what? What happens over time? Well, I told you this happened this was published 32 years ago. So let's look to see what happened to the children. And what we see in this data, and this was published, this is Professor Grantham McGregor's colleague, Sue Walker, who is in Jamaica, and this was published a year ago. And we're looking at standardized IQ here. The black line are the children who were stunted but received the stimulation when they were under age 2 for the first 2 years. The dotted line, the red darker line, represents the children who were stunted but did not. So they did not receive the home visitor. There were no long-term effects of only receiving the milk, so those groups were combined. And you can see that there are substantial differences between the black and red lines, and then it's summarized over on the right. So there were differences in IQ, in depressive symptoms, in what's called grit, like willingness to push yourself forward, in conscientiousness, and they were less likely to use substances or engage in risk-taking behavior. The bottom area shows the difference between the comparison group. Those are the children who were not stunted. And you can see they were higher in IQ than the ones who were stunting, and higher in executive functioning, and lower risk-taking. So it teaches us 2 things. One is that there were long-term effects of the early intervention. And 2, that it's really not great to be stunted in the first place. Not good to be undernourished to the extent that you're stunted, but that you can do something about it. So they're very important studies. So what we decided to do is we wanted to honor Dr. Grantham McGregor. And what would be a big honor for her? Well, she likes to have celebrations, but she really likes science. And so we thought the best way we could honor her is to gather together the work that has been done on early childhood development, focusing very much on caregiving, because caregiving is how it works. That's the pathway to children. So we decided to put together papers that had been done on early caregiving and publish them in a supplement to pediatrics. We chose pediatrics because very early development, the health system is often the entry system to this. And so we decided we wanted to publish it in pediatrics. Well, you don't just send something off to pediatrics and they publish it. That's not how it happens. So we assembled a working group of people who, there were 8 of us, from various disciplines who were interested in early childhood development, and we developed a process. The first process, and this is something that the center could be doing, so I'll tell you the steps. The first process is that we had to raise funds. So we wrote several grants to foundations and raised some funds. And then we invited a group of potential authors, and we did that. It was an open invitation, but we sent notes, sent invitations to 50+ people who had published papers or worked in the area of early child development from around the world. And we invited them to write a concept note. And we developed criteria for assessing the concept notes. So they wrote concept notes, we assessed them, and then we did not select all of them. We selected the best ones, and we invited them to write a paper. They wrote the papers, and we then assessed the papers. And at least 3 people commented on each paper, and we sent it back to them and invited them to revise the papers. They revised the papers, we assessed them again, and we chose the best papers. And those are the papers that we sent to pediatrics. Pediatrics then sent them out for external review. So if you decide to publish something, there has to be a pretty heavy review process to make sure it goes through. These publications are now, they're all open access, so they're available. And the initial article that reviews all of the papers in the supplement is available in Spanish. And in English, there's a QR code. I'm not sure how you get the QR code, but you'll learn. We will sort that out. So what I'm going to do is to review some of the papers so that you can see what some of the new evidence is. This is Professor James Heckman, who's a Nobel laureate in economics. And why would we have an economist who is part of this? This is what Professor Heckman has shown. So what we have is the rate of return on investment in human capital. And you can see that the highest rate of investment in human capital is among 0 to 3. So if you invest in children age 0 to 3, you get a very high rate of return on your investment. If you invest, you see it goes down. So if you're investing in someone who is a postgraduate, you get the least return on investment. You with me? Okay, so this is how do we invest? Here's how we invest. Exactly the opposite. We pay the preschool teachers zip, very little. We pay the professors in medical school the most. Is that how it should be? Well, if you think about return on investment, you may raise a few questions. So Professor Heckman wrote a commentary for the supplement, and he also participated in introducing the Reach Up, which is the Jamaica project, and then made into an available system in China. So they replicated Reach Up in China with 1,500 children. here they did not select kids who were undernourished. They had children at random. And what they found were the benefits were the greatest for children of low and medium ability. And that's because the children of high ability were probably receiving this kinds of intervention anyway. But what they found is that the mechanism, the way intervention worked, is the same way that Grantham McGregor showed it at work. And that's the interaction between the home visitors and the caregivers. So when they compared the effect sizes in the China program with the Jamaica program, you can see that the effect sizes were similar. So that was very helpful in terms of looking at a program that was developed in one place in Jamaica, and could you apply it elsewhere? So this is pretty strong evidence on doing that. Now, this is a systematic review and meta-analysis that was done by Pam Jervis from Chile. And what she did is take 14 randomized trials of Reach Up that were done in a variety of places. You can see India, Peru, Colombia, Madagascar, Jamaica, India, Bangladesh, so many different countries, and then compare their effect sizes. The way that you read this is if you look at the bottom, what I've outlined, that's the pooled analysis. Anything to the right of the 0 line means that it is a positive effect. Anything to the left is not. Anything that crosses the line, it's not quite made it. So you can see, what do we learn from this? That overall, the intervention was effective. But you can see the variability, that in some it was close to the line and not so effective, and in others it was way out. So it varies. It's the same intervention in multiple sites, but certainly overall it was effective. It was also administered in different ways. Sometimes it was a home visiting, and sometimes it was a group. So you can certainly learn a lot from these systematic interventions and meta-analyses. This is another one, and this is where the outcome was home stimulation. So remember, we think that the mechanism that it works is through home stimulation. So this is measuring how stimulating the home environment was. And again, you can see there's variability. And so the one that didn't have so great effects at the top on the last slide is the same one on this one, but overall, they're effective. This one is on maternal depressive symptoms. So did the early intervention improve maternal depressive symptoms? And the answer is no. So what this tells us is that there's intervention specificity. Intervention specificity means in order to get a positive output, you have to have a positive input. And so this intervention did well on children's development, but it for the most part, it wasn't effective on maternal depressive symptoms. So it doesn't change everything. With me? Some places it did, but overall it didn't. So what we learn is that there weren't differences in the impact of the intervention based on maternal education. So it worked regardless of how well educated the moms were. There was a larger effect when children were over 12 months rather than under 12 months. The largest effect sizes were when it was targeted to undernourished kids. So that's a positive thing that we learned, and that's because the children who were well-nourished were probably receiving these things anyway. The undernourishment meaning that's a marker for probably not receiving some of these the interventions. And that the delivery was greater with home delivery versus home visits. But there are only 3 trials that showed that. But before that, things had been primarily in home visits. Now we know you can do it in groups, and you can do it in multiple sites. So I'm going to show you a few more things that are included in the supplement. Again, you can download this and do it yourselves. So this is some new evidence, and this is adapting for context. So this is because of COVID, you have to adapt. You can't do things as you did before because of social distancing. So Reach Up was adapted for remote delivery in Brazil, Ecuador, Jamaica, and they was able to show effects on parenting practices. And it was also adapted in 3 humanitarian situations, in crisis and conflict. And unfortunately, we're having more and more crisis and conflict areas in our world. And again, they were able to show that benefits of the intervention even in these very disastrous sites. So what you learn is that to apply early child development in these kinds of sites, you need to think of multiple other child and caregiver needs, like especially safety and feeling secure. That you need linkage to services based on the priority of the communities. In other words, don't think you can do everything. You need activities especially for older kids, and that while remote can be useful, in person is probably a stronger way to go. This looks at integrating services and timing. Timing of programs is certainly a critical aspect. So this was combining early child development with violence prevention. That was done in Rwanda. And it's combining early child development with depression. And that was done in Bangladesh. So what they did in Bangladesh is that they had an intervention for depressive symptoms, which is called thinking positive. And when you did the thinking positive and did the early child development, then you got an impact on both. So it shows that there's some intervention specificity. And the Mayer study in India, they evaluated an intervention prior to age 3, and then they evaluated an intervention after age 3, and both of them were effective on children's development. But those kids who got both interventions, you did not see an additive effect. So it tells us that when you don't see something, it's also an opportunity illustrating that we have much more to learn as to why they didn't have gains from both interventions. This one looks at the duration of effects, the Hussein one in Bangladesh, where they had an early intervention with children who had anemia or did not have anemia, and they showed effects on the children who did not have anemia. And then 6 years later, when the kids were 8 or 9, they looked at their IQ, and they showed the children who did not have anemia and got the intervention early on continued to show benefits. The kids who did have anemia didn't show benefits in the beginning and didn't show them at end. So we have more to learn about anemia and how to prevent anemia, because unhealthy for kids. So these are just a little taste of some of the other things in the intervention. This is one by Raquel Burnell, who you heard this morning, and she worked with the FAMI program in Colombia, and looked at the issue of quality and how you could improve quality in a program, and did it matter. So they focused on training and supervision of the visitors, on structured curricula, and on play materials. And then they observed group sessions and looked at attendance and parenting practices and child development, and they found benefits on both. This is in a randomized trial. It's a very innovative way of doing things. So quality of early intervention clearly matters. This is showing the diagram of how it goes, meaning that you could see that those the pathway up through quality and then to parenting practices and children's development. Okay, and this is scaling violence prevention in Jamaica. This is a paper that focuses primarily on how to scale things. That's why I included it here, because taking an individual program and then making it into a widely available program is a big step. And you can see the recommendations for this are things like designing a program for scaling from the outset and knowing that you need to learn as you go. So it's learning cycles for quality improvement. Don't think you take a program and then that's the end of the story, that there's an ongoing learning. So plan strategically for government adoption by having them involved. And this, again, high quality training and supervision and flexible delivery. Who knows when you're going to have another pandemic? Hopefully not. But having some flexibility to deal with it, and then plan for sustainability, not just this year, next year, and next year. So these 9 are basically a summary of the things that we've already talked about, of the findings. So as I say it quickly, it's the reach up can be delivered by home visits, by groups, by small groups for caregivers, and can be developed remotely. The benefits are greatest among children who have experienced adversities. So that means one could target communities where you know there are adversities. That there are findings on durability. There are not many. There's the long-term study I showed you in the Jamaica children. But it's more convincing when you can see that there's durability. Remote can benefit parenting. That quality matters. That if you want an impact on maternal depressive symptoms, plan for it. Build in an intervention. That early child development can be integrated in with other interventions. That they strengthen the capacity of parents and caregivers to give children the care that they need to fill their potential. And it's a compelling case for countries to invest in early child development to reach the kids at greatest need. And who benefits? Not only the children, but the country. These are just some ongoing research issues. The story's not over. There's still much to be learned about the mechanisms driving changes, how you make sure they're durable, how you involve caregivers, and then whether you have single versus multiple component interventions. That's whether you bundle child development with other things. You would initially think that's a terrific idea, to bundle things together. That works. Well, it sometimes works. But the potential risks in terms of doing that is if you bundle it with a health system, then the health systems, we have very siloed implementation systems. So health answers to health, or nutrition answers to nutrition, and child development answers to something else. So who is running it? It can be confusing. How do you train community workers to deliver both violence and child development, or violence prevention in child development? That can be challenging. And how about the caregiver? You can overwhelm caregivers by having too many messages or messages that conflict. So there's more work that needs to be done here. These are a few notes on scaling. I think we've talked about these. The only focus that I want to make sure that we mention has been mentioned before, and that's under stakeholder involvement. So we've talked about government agencies and about NGOs and the current providers of child care programs, but I wanted to make sure that we mentioned families, that early on, when I talked about the pathways, when families had 2 children, they were very interested in investing in those children. So the groundswell comes from the top down and from the bottom up. So families should be involved as we're moving forward with early child development. They have much to say in this. The other part is we need data systems. We need data systems so that we understand that what works today may or may not work tomorrow. Life changes, pandemics come, countries gain more money, they lose money. Priorities in families go up, they go down, they change. So data systems enable us to monitor, are we reaching those of the greatest need? They keep us honest. They keep us honest. So data systems we need, and then sustainability. So I thank you very much. I want to show that nurturing care sits within the Sustainable Development Goals. It's right in the center. If you're interested in sustaining development, where would you start? You would start at the first 1,000 days. You would start with children's development. So countries who invest in child development are laying the groundwork for a brighter future, not only for the children and families, but for the countries. So, thank you very much.
Gracias, Maureen, por tu presentación. Invitamos ahora a Marta, Rubio y a Giordano Pérez a unirse al escenario para continuar con el diálogo. Muchas gracias.
Marta Rubio-Codina, economista senior de la División de Protección Social y especialista en Desarrollo Infantil del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo. Antes de unirse al banco, fue investigadora senior en el Instituto de Estudios Fiscales de Londres. Marta tiene amplia experiencia en el diseño, implementación y evaluación de intervenciones de trabajo con familias a escala y con gobiernos para la promoción del desarrollo infantil en Colombia, Perú, Ecuador, Panamá y la India. Actualmente trabaja en el diseño de estrategias para mejorar la calidad de las interacciones en centros de cuidado infantil en México. También participa de una serie de esfuerzos para identificar instrumentos de medición del desarrollo infantil en niños muy pequeños que sean costo efectivos en su uso a escala. Y ha codiseñado módulos de desarrollo infantil en encuestas nacionales de salud y nutrición en México y Ecuador. Su trabajo se ha publicado en varias revistas económicas y médicas revisadas por pares, incluidas el British Medical Journal, PLOS Medicine, Science Advances, Journal of Development Economics y American Economic Review. Giordano Pérez Gaxiola, director de Cochrane México y subdirector de la red Cochrane Iberoamericana. Giordano Pérez Gaxiola es pediatra egresado del Hospital San José Tecnológico de Monterrey con maestría en medicina basada en evidencia del Centro Cochrane Iberoamericano, Universidad Rovira y Virgil y la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona. Es investigador nacional número 1. También es miembro fundador del programa de habilidades de lectura crítica en México. Es autor de los libros Medicina basada en evidencia, Fundamentos y su enseñanza en el contexto clínico e Historias de terror para mamás.
Muy bien. Muchas gracias por la invitación y por el honor de coordinar este panel. Adriana, Manuel, Marta, Maureen, Manuel, deberías de estar en puras M's aquí. En la mañana el doctor Torre hablaba de, hace algún tiempo antes de que cuando iban empezando esto, como que tenía poca familiaridad con el tema de infancia temprana y decía que era porque era médico de adultos y pues como quisiera pensar que nosotros los pediatras estamos mucho más involucrados en estas intervenciones de infancia temprana. La realidad es que cuando estás metido al viendo al paciente individual, tú te enfocas, ok, llegó este niño con un retraso en el lenguaje y pues ya estás pensando en qué hacer con el niño en ese punto y no te pones a pensar en cómo te pudiste haber involucrado en actividades antes de que llegara ese niño ahí. Entonces, es un mensaje para los que nos dedicamos a la salud de los niños. Ahora, no sé si se fijaron, en el primer panel tuvimos un panel de personas que hablaban inglés, luego tuvimos un panel de personas que hablaban español y ahora tenemos un panel donde una de las ponentes habla inglés, la otra habla catalán, entonces quise tirar un volado. Entonces, Si caía águila, es una águila devorando una serpiente, es un símbolo mexicano, entonces es español. Y si caía sello, era una moneda de 10 pesos, era el calendario azteca, entonces es español. Entonces vamos a hacer las preguntas en español, but if at any time you want to switch languages, Maureen, we can switch. Ok, dentro de los artículos del suplemento, uno de los primeros es la revisión sistemática, donde se mostraba el metaanálisis con esos. Es una revisión que incluye 18 estudios y venía el metaanálisis con 8 de ellos. Me llamó la atención que había países de Asia, países de África y también países del Caribe y de Latinoamérica. Y me puse a pensar, o sea, ¿cuál es la ruta o el camino que siguen estos países para poder involucrarse o implementar un programa como Reach Up, para implementarlo de manera nacional o de manera regional? No sé si… Marta.
Gracias. De los 18 países que están incluidos en el metaanálisis, la forma como Reach Up llegó a ellos, y en realidad para los primeros no era Reach Up per se, Reach Up ha sido un poquito el resultado de la implementación del modelo de Jamaica que nos explicaba Maureen en varios de estos países, ha sido muy distinta. Entonces, esa tabla del metaanálisis está combinando estudios de muy distinta escala, con diferentes propósitos de investigación y procurando responder a distintas implementaciones, distintas preguntas de investigación, cada uno de ellos. Pero sí ha habido un proceso por ejemplo, uno de los artículos incluidos en el suplemento, en el caso de China, y hay una implementación a escala muy grande. Y dentro del metaanálisis también se incluyen estudios que han estado en este proceso de transicionar a la escala. El caso de Perú, el que aparecía, y tú levantaste un punto muy importante, y el impacto en Perú es mucho menor al impacto en Jamaica y contribuye a un impacto total pues menor de lo esperado probablemente. Perú, la implementación fue a nivel nacional por un organismo de gobierno, por el programa CUNAMAS, Programa Nacional CUNAMAS, que depende del MIDES, del Ministerio de Desarrollo y Inclusión Social. Entonces, en el caso de Perú, que veíamos impactos chiquititos de 0.10, en realidad respondían a un estudio de investigación de unos 5.000 hogares, pero que reflejaba una realidad de implementación de más de 63.000, no sé si son 63, 67.000 familias en el momento en el que se estaba haciendo la evaluación. Y Perú llegó a este despliegue de Reach Up, del modelo, de su adaptación propia al del modelo de Jamaica en 3 años, 2012 a 2015. Entonces, eso explica un poquito también las diferencias de impacto. Perú, por ejemplo, aprendió mucho de Colombia, de un ejercicio que se hizo en Colombia con lo que era el programa de transferencias condicionadas del momento, Familias en Acción, para entender, y eso era un estudio de investigación que también está incluido en el metaanálisis. El propósito del ejercicio en Colombia era entender cómo podemos implementar estos programas a escala. Y la estrategia fue a través de las promotoras que tenían ustedes de Progresa, Oportunidades, Prospera, las promotoras que existían. Colombia también tiene sus propias promotoras, se llaman Madres Líderes, y la idea era formarlas a ella como visitadoras que iban a hacer las visitas de juego a los hogares, aprovechando una infraestructura que ya estaba construida y anclada en el país y aprovechando que eran personas que tenían contacto directo con las familias de la comunidad porque eran miembros mismos de la comunidad, lo cual se pensaba que era una estrategia para reducir costos, esto estaba liderado por economistas, pero también para aumentar la apropiación y el arraigo con el programa mismo. Entonces, Colombia no adoptó, eso fue un ejercicio de investigación que se trabajó con el gobierno de Colombia. Colombia no lo adoptó, pero por ejemplo sí dio muchos mecanismos que permitieron una aproximación con el gobierno de Perú y construir CUNAMAS en Perú. Entonces, como que las formas de llegada son múltiples. Hay otros estudios que descansan, son investigadores locales que tienen un deseo, un interés de implementar el modelo. Hay un proceso de adaptación del modelo a cada uno de estos distintos contextos, eso es fundamental, muy importante. Y sí, hay una variedad de casos. Ahora que Reach Up se ha consolidado como Reach Up, hay una demanda creciente por el uso de este programa. Sí, y se está expandiendo a muchos más lugares en el mundo. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Dentro del tema hay un tópico que es la alfabetización en salud, que los países, las comunidades que tienen un menor índice de alfabetización en salud tienen menor participación en programas de detección temprana de enfermedades, tienen mayor morbilidad, tienen mayores índices de mortalidad. En pocas palabras, entre menos alfabetización, te cuidas menos, te enfermas más y te mueres más temprano. Entonces, hay ciertos programas que tratan de implementar medidas para alfabetizar en salud a las poblaciones. Uno de ellos, el proyecto Informed Health Choices, Decisiones Informadas en Salud, nació en Uganda y se hizo un ensayo clínico masivo de más de 10,000 niños de 10 años, no de infancia temprana, eran niños de 10 años y a estos niños les enseñaban cómo evaluar afirmaciones sobre tratamientos. Alguna persona que dijera que tal cosa servía para tal enfermedad o cualquier remedio, les enseñaban a los niños si creerle o no creerle. Pero lo que me llamó la atención, aparte de que era una infancia tal vez tardía a los 10 años, era que a los papás también les enseñaban. Y se veía un impacto de cómo cambiaba la percepción y cómo aprendían este tipo de habilidades. Entonces se me vino a la mente, estos programas, Maureen, ¿contienen algún componente de alfabetización en salud, tal vez para los papás?
Okay, ready for some English? Thank you. I think I can answer this question in perhaps 3 ways or 3 examples. The first one is that when we're thinking about early intervention for young children and we're working with families on activities that young children are doing, what's behind our mind is that it's not just encouraging families to stack blocks or to do an activity with the child, but it's helping a parent learn to recognize signs from children and to communicate back and forth with children. Because the blocks of today become puzzles of tomorrow and become more complex activities as one goes. So we're not teaching them the blocks, we're teaching them to listen to their children, to respond to their children, and to do what we call scaffolding. So that means as a child acquires skill A, that the parent then responds to the skill A and gives skill B. And the child then practices skill B and learns that and goes on to skill C. So at the same time as they're communicating in this back and forth or serve and return, that what happens also, the caregiver is learning to listen to the child, and one can incorporate other aspects into this, both physical health and emotional health. So the emotional health, it can be that as a parent and a child are communicating, the parent notices that the child is looking sad or the child is looking happy. And so that's a response to that, helps the child then regulate their emotional health. So you have heard about regulation and how children develop that. Well, they develop it not just from being happy every day. No one's happy every day, every minute. So there's a back and forth between a happy and a sad and learning to deal with the variety in emotional health. Well, physical health can be the same kind of thing in terms of learning how to assess one's physical health, whether, and how to be more literate in terms of health. So that comes along with these early interventions. That's one example. A second example that I would give is a project that I worked on in a very little country that was called Swaziland. It's in the middle of South Africa. Now it's called Eswatini. And we worked on a project there among mothers who were living with HIV. And they had children. And because of the advances that we've made in preventing vertical transmission, then their offspring were exposed to HIV prenatally, but they were negative. So we did an early intervention program, evaluated whether an early intervention program introduced into the prevention of vertical transmission clinics could, if you had differential benefit among children who were HIV exposed but negative. And as part of that intervention, there was a health literacy component for the mothers who they themselves were living with HIV. And it's an example of incorporating early child development along with health into an intervention. So one can do that. And the health literacy part then focused on clinic visits for the mothers to maintain their exposure to the antiretroviral therapy that they are taking lifelong, and to monitor their children's health. So it's an example of doing that, of incorporating health literacy. The third part of the comment that I wanted to make is that we've certainly done that with children who are living with chronic illnesses, such as type 1 diabetes, in learning how to manage them so that they manage, to the extent that they're possible, their health conditions. Children want to be autonomous from about, what would you say, 3 months, 4 months? Very early, children want to be autonomous. And so, and of course, at that point, there's very little that they can do. But you know that in the second 6 months, you can teach them hand signs. Long before they can speak, they can tell you this. And what does this mean? It means get out of the chair and give me more, right now. So children can learn very early on. And you can help them learn some of the physical signs, or if they have physical disabilities or chronic illnesses, there are aspects that you can help them learn to manage within their capability. So, yeah, thank you.
Excelente, muy interesante, muchas gracias. La siguiente pregunta quisiera hacérselas a las dos. Dentro de todos esos dos estudios y de la mayoría de las experiencias que se han compartido el día de hoy, la gran mayoría son cosas que han funcionado, implementaciones exitosas, intervenciones exitosas. Y de cierta manera es muy inspirador y muy motivador ver estas experiencias exitosas, pero por otro lado, el ver los fracasos, las fallas, los obstáculos también educa mucho. Entonces, no sé si nos pudieran dar algún ejemplo, algún par de ejemplos de cosas que han salido mal en este tipo de implementaciones o de intervenciones, o que han tenido resultados negativos, como para pensar en los obstáculos y los retos que se pudiera enfrentar este nuevo centro de infancia temprana del TEC de Monterrey.
Yes, okay. I could say if I'm thinking about moving forward and how to account for things that don't go so well, I would say that there's three pieces of advice, or three recommendations, and they all begin with A. So the first one is accountability. The second one is adoption, and the third one is applause. Now, what does that mean? Let's see. So accountability means that, that you have set up your 4 pillars. And the center has your 4 pillars moving forward, and you can see them right here. So they're not hard to remember. Accountability means that a year from now, and then 2 years from now and onward, how are you doing on these 4 pillars? So in order to know how you're doing, you have to have accountability. You have to have a system of being able to assess, another A word, what's happening. Is there success? Is there more success, less success than you want? So that accountability keeps all of us honest. But you have to set it up so that you do have accountability. And it has to include such things as satisfaction. So not only are children's development improving, But are you reaching the, those that you want to reach, and is satisfaction there? So satisfaction among who? That's the whole range of stakeholders, including the families and including the frontline providers and including those who have their fingers on the donations or on the funding. So the accountability has a broad reach to be able to assess it. So the second part is what the accountability leads to is the adaptation. So adaptation means that when something has not gone well, or is not gone as well as you think it could or should, or there's been some kind of change, that you're able to adapt and you're able to make a course correction. So there's a continuous quality improvement that goes on. And the third part is applause. And that means to celebrate successes, and even small successes, but to celebrate them broadly among all the stakeholders so that you're proud of what has happened, because clearly there have been successes. Clearly there have been things that have gone as you want them to go. So it's to celebrate, because what that does is it keeps forefront, it keeps the spirit, it keeps the motivation among those that you're working with. At the same time as you're celebrating, you're looking at those things that you've had to adapt, and you're learning from those things that haven't gone as well. So there's a balance to some extent, but surely there's an opportunity to celebrate not only what has happened, but where you're moving forward.
Gracias, Maureen. En términos de el diseño y implementación de programas e intervenciones, que hemos hablado un poquito de esto en la tarde y en la mañana también, creo que los mismos tres elementos que marca Maureen aplican, ¿no? Rendir cuentas, monitoreo y evaluación constante, partiendo de un buen diagnóstico, se ha mencionado esto también en la mañana, la capacidad de adaptabilidad y adaptar cuando lo que hablábamos también, ¿no? Distintas realidades necesitan respuestas distintas porque enfrentan problemáticas que pueden parecer similares pero tienen sus propios matices. Entonces ese proceso de adaptar al contexto local y a la institucionalidad local los programas es muy importante, y si no se hace hay fracasos estrepitosos, que es verdad, no se habla mucho de ellos. Y luego el tema de reconocer, aplaudir los logros, aunque sean pequeños logros, también los esfuerzos. Siendo un poco más… es verdad que hay un sesgo en las publicaciones de publicar lo que funciona bien. El espacio en las publicaciones normalmente es muy limitado, particularmente en las revistas médicas. Las revistas de economía te permiten 300 páginas y hablas sin decir mucho, pero en revistas médicas hay que ser muy puntual, entonces no hay mucho espacio para hablar del cómo. Y este cómo en las intervenciones de primera infancia es fundamental. Hemos estado hablando de la importancia de las interacciones, el servir y el devolver, el promover cambios de comportamiento en familias que permitan dar a los niños estas herramientas para que se conviertan en personas sanas. Entonces, esto no es como, y no quiero… pero no es como un programa de transferencias condicionadas o de entrega de suplementación nutricional, que también son muy difíciles, la logística de implementación a escala, no los estoy disminuyendo de ninguna forma, pero aquí estamos… O sea, estas intervenciones de primera infancia realmente descansan en personas que trabajan con personas para cambiar el comportamiento de cuidadores de niños, tal que estos niños se promocionen, se promuevan. La palabra también salió en la mañana. Hay esta cultura de la promoción, de desarrollo de oportunidades. Entonces, la implementación de estos programas es muy complicada. Y prestar atención suficiente a este cómo, adaptándolo bien a la realidad, al contexto local, es muy importante. Ejemplos de fracasos, muchos, casi es más larga que mi lista de la mañana de deseos y necesidades para el centro. Querer correr demasiado, porque hay que responder a tiempos políticos, hay que responder a prioridades. No tomar en cuenta, no incorporar, por ejemplo, a los gobiernos, a las contrapartes, y suficientemente desde un inicio. Eso también es un gran error, porque luego no se facilita el proceso de escalamiento. querer replicar el modelo, por ejemplo, y esto hemos sufrido, el mismo equipo de ReachUp, querer implicar ReachUp como, o sea, no ser flexibles, no adaptarnos suficientemente a las necesidades de otros contextos u otros entornos. El compromiso, ¿no? Poderse comprometer, poder negociar cambios dada una realidad, eso es realmente fundamental. Y en ese proceso de negociación, de comprometer una cosa por la otra, creo que algo que a veces, otro error que a veces se comete es que se prioriza la cantidad versus la calidad, en parte porque es más fácil, en parte porque responde también a necesidades de los donantes, de los gobiernos, pero eso es un error muy grave porque, de nuevo, el éxito de estas intervenciones está en la calidad con la que se implementa todos los servicios de desarrollo infantil en realidad. Entonces, sí, este no priorizar, este querer correr, este no ser suficientemente flexibles, el que no haya un monitoreo, el que no haya un seguimiento también de largo plazo. A veces las intervenciones son exitosas en el corto plazo, pero no hay seguimientos de largo plazo o no hay suficiente investigación en los procesos. Nos hemos centrado mucho en las evaluaciones de impacto, pero no suficientemente en evaluaciones ágiles de procesos, también porque hay un sesgo. Es más difícil de publicar, es como más tedioso, más aburrido todo cómo, no hay un resultado así fuerte, pero es muy necesario entender estos procesos en el mismo proceso de diseño de la intervención y de diseño de la estrategia de implementación. No podemos esperar 1 año y medio hasta que lleguen los resultados y otro año y medio hasta que los hayamos procesado para tomar acción, porque como hemos visto, ¿no? El momento es muy urgente, los niños que necesitan respuestas ahora. Entonces, sí, empezar a pensar en cambiar un poquito la forma como entendemos la investigación, creo que también es importante y es un error que a veces cometemos. No invertir suficiente en evaluaciones más cualitativas, más de procesos ágiles que nos den resultados inmediatos que nos permitan responder de forma inmediata. Y voy a parar la lista aquí por ahora.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, Maureen, Marta. Por mi parte, también quería terminar con una reflexión, tiene que ver más con aquellos 2 pilares de investigación y de vinculación. El suplemento da evidencia de investigaciones, múltiples investigaciones de cómo se han implementado de manera exitosa algunas intervenciones. De esto, cierta manera, hace un cuerpo de evidencia para tratar de informar una política pública. Uno de los objetivos del centro es generar investigación. Esa investigación, en teoría, debería de dar un cuerpo de evidencia que informe políticas públicas, pero yo me quisiera ir más atrás. Esa investigación debe de partir de un cuerpo de evidencia que se haya investigado y sintetizado antes. Por eso es necesario hacer una buena revisiones sistemáticas y síntesis de evidencia antes de emprender cualquier investigación, y ahí es donde viene la parte de vinculación. El centro pudiera tener algún vínculo con organizaciones que se dedican a esto, como la colaboración Campbell, que es como el hermano de la colaboración Cochrane, que está enfocada completamente a la salud. La colaboración Campbell abarca más ciencias sociales y abarca tanto medicina como se va a educación y se va a economía, entonces puede ser un nexo muy interesante ahí para el centro. Y bueno, con esto concluimos este panel. Muchas gracias, Maureen, muchas gracias, Marta, y muchas gracias por la invitación.
Muchas gracias, Maureen, Marta.